everyone. Thanks for joining us today.
Wait, 1 second.
Let me know when I should go.
Yeah. It'll take a second for the YouTube link and this to match up.
Thanks for joining us today.
We can get started now.
Okay. Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us today for the fall lecture series here at the Cleveland Urban Design Collaborative. I'm Terry Schwartz. I'm the director of the CUDC, and on behalf of the College of Architecture and Environmental Design at Kent State, just want to thank you for being here. October is a big month in our programming series. We have lectures every Friday at noon for the rest of the month, including our spooky Halloween lecture with the American Roundtable that probably actually won't be spooky or about Halloween. But it's a really interesting month series with everything from youth design programs to urban manufacturing. So I do hope you'll join us, and I know you're kind of in for a really interesting talk today. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Kilian Riano, who will introduce our speaker.
Hello, everyone. It is my pleasure today to both echo Terry inviting you to join us for the rest of the fall 2020 programming, and to introduce a designer that I think is doing some incredible work in Boston, Sabrina Dorsainvil. And I'll read her bio and then we'll let her get started. Sabrina Dorsainvil is an artist, designer, and illustrator. She's currently the director of Civic Design for the City of Boston's Mayor's Office of New Urban Mechanics. There she uses creative approaches to address issues within areas such as housing, public health, and human rights. She has collaborated with a range of organizations and projects around social, spatial, and environmental justice. She previously worked with the social impact design studio, Designing the We, to create the traveling exhibition on Design the Red Line that exposes policies, practices, and investments that perpetuate inequality in American cities. Her artwork takes on many forms in its unpacking of exploration of identity, storytelling, and celebration of our shared humanity. Please join me in welcoming Sabrina to our lecture series, and can't wait to hear more about your work both as an artist and illustrator and within the New Urban Mechanics group.
Hi there, thank you so much for that introduction. Can you hear me? Perfect. So as Kilian said, my name is Sabrina Dorsainvil, and I am a designer, illustrator, and artist. And I'm coming to you all on the traditional land of the Massachusetts people, also known as Jamaica Plain in Boston, Massachusetts, for those of you coming from different places. I'm so grateful to be here. I'm so grateful to have the opportunity to share a little more of my work with the Mayor's Office of New Urban Mechanics, generally speaking about the team, and sharing a bit of our practice. So thank you again for having me, and I will jump in. So it's helpful for me to start a little bit talking about where I'm coming from. So the photo at the top is a little bit blurry, but this is an image of me in high school working with an organization called Groundwork Lawrence. And the photo on the bottom is me right in undergrad working with an organization called the Center for Art and Community Partnerships. And I share this as like one of the first images just to share that, in my mind for quite a long time has constantly been this urgency to investigate everyday needs, right? And really try and figure out ways to navigate the realities we face. And I've been grateful to be able to do that in multiple different ways at a young age and really see the value in more people interrogating that and figuring out what their own civic practices. Also part of my work is trying to use art and creativity to create reminders of our shared humanity and the sort of need for joy that we all do, especially in times like these, but always. Also spending a lot of time thinking about how to build a practice of creative reflection and really think about process intentionally, and how do we bring folks into that work, but also how do we do that with ourselves and really spend time deeply thinking about the things that we care about, the sort of people around us, and the ways in which we want to see the spaces that we inhabit change and shift and grow. And also spent a lot of time questioning our context, and really trying to peel back the layers on the sort of systemic challenges that many of us have consistently known have existed. And I think in this moment of time, we have quite a national conversation happening to hold all of us accountable to recognizing and seeing those systemic challenges. And then while daunting, and I remember, being asked to critically think, and I struggled to wrap my head around, like, am I doing it right? Am I doing it right? And I think even that question of asking myself, am I doing it right, is one of those nods to know that I am, right? I am thinking about it. And I think we constantly need to figure out, what are the systems, not just city systems, but systems in general that we are existing within? Whose imagination were those? And how do we imagine an alternative future? And so those are just things that I sit with when I think about how I enter into this work with the newer mechanics, but I think with my practice overall. And so what is the newer mechanics, also known as MONA, or the urban mechanics? We are an R&D team formed in 2010 with the intent to improve the quality of life for Boston residents. And when we say R&D team, we sort of joke it could be research and design, research and do. It can be a lot of things, but the point is to think about different ways that we can experiment and offer, again, an alternative perspective as to what local government can do to make life better for the folks that spend their time in those cities, in those spaces. And so, again, for those of you who are not familiar with Boston, just sharing that we have about 700,000 residents, and we are made up of, it says 23 unique neighborhoods, but I know folks who have spent time here or from here know that even that, can be broken down to far more. And it's helpful to note that we are an immigrant city and have quite a lot of folks that are coming from across the world and calling Boston home. And thinking about infrastructure, I think. So this note about, we have 850 miles of streets, thinking about Boston as one of the sort of oldest cities in the nation as we know it. It's helpful to note that there's a lot of effort that has to go into thinking about land use and thinking about public infrastructure, whether that be parks, open space, and our streets. And so, the newer mechanics are situated in the context of a mayor's office. And what we have tried to hold, and what I think cities, especially in the last 10 years, have tried to hold, is what does it mean to exist in the context of having to navigate crumbling infrastructure, really having to sit with years upon years of systemic racism and violence. What does it mean, especially as a coastal city, to try and navigate issues around climate change, right, and environmental justice? And I think we're grateful that for the last 6 years of our 10 years that we've had a mayor that does believe in the work that we are trying to do, and also sees this opportunity for the city to be incredibly thoughtful, and we can see that in a lot of the folks that we work with. But many of you are also probably wondering, why are you called the newer mechanics, and where does that come from? And so it's really helpful to note that the original urban mechanic was our former mayor, Mayor Menino, and he was called an urban mechanic, not in an endearing way necessarily, but he was sort of deemed as less of the deep planner and more of the, if it's broken, we should fix it. And so in his sort of last few years of being in office, he was encountered with this question of technology changing quite quickly, and what does a city do to keep up with it, in addition to having to acknowledge that everyone has the capacity to be an urban mechanic, right? Has the capacity to enact that change, to see something, flag it, and want to be a part of changing it. And so that is our namesake. And who are we as a team? So I am one of about 9 or 10 folks. We all come from very different backgrounds. We have folks that practice movement in addition to thinking about, digital trust in the public realm. And we have folks who, used to be like former former biology teachers, folks who studied art history, folks who studied technology, folks who practiced as educators and music teachers, and folks who come from all different parts of the world. And so, it's helpful to note this because the work really can't be done without people. And, while I'm showing you who our team is, nothing that we do is done in isolation. And so we're constantly working with city departments in addition to trying to offer ourselves up as an open door to folks who have a great idea or have questions or are concerned about their neighborhoods and the spaces that they live and they work and they play in and want to see change. And so we are constantly trying to, build opportunities for the practice of local government to look different. And this question around innovation or change, right, is not about shiny or new, but really about asking a different set of questions and knowing that having a diversity of people at those spaces really can help get us there. And what's also helpful to note is, we're also sitting in this moment, like many other organizations and many other spaces, asking ourselves, despite believing and caring and holding such value and importance of people being at the core and the center of what we do, what does it really mean to have an anti-racist practice? And in particular, as a designer, I would say that, design isn't inherently good, right? And we need to actually question, where does humanity show up in our work, right? How do we center truly on things like justice and repair? And what tools can we all, again, designer and insert version of that here, and otherwise, and knowing that things like policy are by design, right? That our spaces are by design, and this sort of commitment to change and sort of reckoning with the challenges of the past is work, and it's increasingly difficult, I think, and we're holding that to be a public sector team asking that question, because we are a part of what is a challenging system that is fortified, right, in its practice, but is just as every other organization, ready for change. And so I mentioned that early in the sort of origin story of the neuromechanics, technology had a big role to play. And part of that, it was because there was this big question around where, city governments are going to play in this arena. How do we support residents? How does this impact residents? And, that work is still coming full circle, but it's very, very important to note that we are not centered on that alone, right? So it's not about apps, it's not about KPIs, it's not about all of that first at all. It's really about people. And I will say that our portfolio work really does expand far beyond just thinking about technology, but I think it's helpful to also appreciate that the world is changing quite fast, and there's a big role for technology to play, but we definitely believe that people honestly need to be at the core, need to be first, and then whatever the outcome is can come. And so thinking about the way that we work is funny, because we want to have this perfect outline of, we take in projects, right? We explore, we experiment, and we evaluate, right? And we have this question of, can this thing scale? What does scale look like? And context really drives that question. But we often joke that this is actually what the work really looks like, because the starting point of a project comes from so many different places. And as you can imagine, working in the context of a city, there's so many there's no shortage, rather, of things that you can do, that you should do, that folks are asking for, that we're seeing the need and the desire to address and to shape and to shift. And so, yes, it is far messier, and we're really excited that there are many folks who want to jump into that mess with us. And so we often get this question of, what do you prioritize and how do you prioritize? And we have a good idea of the city's priorities, right? From the mayor, but also from the countless folks that are working on the ground, and the departments that are interacting with said folks, and the work that we've done, and the work that we're sort of not only bystanders to, but co-conspirators with. And so it's not just looking at, one moment when you ask someone what's important, but trying to stitch a connection between all of those things. And so we have an exciting role of trying to connect those dots and saying, we're hearing this from this department, and we're hearing this from another department. We're also hearing this from residents in that particular area. And we're hearing this from, the past actions that have happened in that particular place. And it sounds like there's an opportunity here. And I also want to flag that it's not that we're experts. We're definitely not, but we are sort of willing to be in that moment of saying, okay, how do we navigate that messiness, and who needs to be a part of navigating that messiness, and being willing to sort of experiment and try, and know that learning by doing is also incredibly important, especially in spaces that recreate past actions constantly without really creating or having the space to reflect on them. And so, just for the sake of trying to ground it for folks, our work currently does touch a lot of different areas, everything from thinking about future streets and mobility, thinking about welcoming and resilient spaces, housing, thinking about education, and really, I think when we say youth empowerment, really like where are young people, and we see them showing up, but how do we receive them as a city? How do we support them? How do we lift them up, knowing that they are our now and our future? Thinking about like collective well-being and economic mobility, storytelling and engagement, really, and this new body of work that again feels like full circle of really interrogating what digital trust can look like, and how does technology impact the public realm. And over the years, we could make massively long lists of the lessons learned, but these have consistently been helpful places to sort of orient and share the breadth of things that we have done, have continued to try and work through, and these sort of questions we're asking. And so just reading them off for those of you following along, is how you build is just as important as what you build. Using technology to build trust and compassion, encouraging and enabling civic action, being delightful, building things that people want and need, and not just what we already know how to build, which is incredibly important, especially for folks working with the built environment, and creating a comfort of risk-taking within government. And I mean, I think number 4, be delightful, feels like the most obvious one to say, like, what? Like, what do you mean? What does city government have to do with delightfulness? But I think looking at, everything from filing a form to showing up to a space to navigating a process of deciding what happens in your neighborhood, that shouldn't add to the stress of your everyday life in a way that makes it so that that question of whether or not you can thrive is strained. And so, and that's sort of one way to look at it, but I also think that like delightfulness as a utility is incredibly important, in line with things like care and compassion. And so I will just quickly run through projects that really, they could probably sit across all of those 6 lessons learned and guiding principles, but hopefully will help ground this sort of picture of some of the things that we've been up to over the last 10 years and even recently. So in the question of like how you build being just as important as what you build, when I first joined the Neuromechanics, I was a part of the Housing Innovation Lab, and it was a unit set up between what we have called the Department of Neighborhood Development and the Neuromechanics team as a place to really start to experiment issues around housing, like what can we do? And obviously our team was not going to be the ones developing new units, but we were going to be the ones to ask a different set of questions and sort of push the city to be open to new ideas as to how we would fill the need of developing affordable housing for folks who are both low income and middle income. And I say that, and you see on the screen, I have middle income residents in quotes, because one of the first charges that we had in that unit was to think about how to support middle income residents in particular. How do we sort of build, buy, and own middle income housing? What did that look like? And one of the first things that we really wanted to take a step back and do and say, you know, what does middle income mean? Like, we don't walk around and identify ourselves as, you know, I'm middle income, what are you, right? And so you can see the image in the center is an example of us actually spending time with folks in 2 planning areas that the city was already engaging in, just asking that question. And, you know, part of this is grounding for us, because we know that when we enter into deeper conversations with folks, we shouldn't be making assumptions, right? We should be grounded in already a sensibility around the way that folks are talking about these things. And so you can see, like, we were asking folks, where does that bracket fall? And we got wildly differing answers. And it just shows that, you know, some of the things that we're doing inside the building, right, of City Hall, or those sort of spaces where the decisions are made, we may be actually out of touch with the way that people are engaging with some of those things, and that we should actually pause and take a step back and really ground ourselves and say, maybe we're approaching this in a way that is not actually going to be as fruitful as it could be. And so you can see on the other 2 sides that there's sort of examples of, you know, us continuing to do sort of intercepts like that to get a better understanding of people navigating their space in the city of Boston. But then sort of the image at the top right is you know, one of the first projects I had the pleasure of being a part of with an organization called Twig and Fish, was actually sitting with folks in their homes and going through and navigating, like, what does it look like to be a resident in the city? What does my housing journey look like? How do I identify, right? And how do I sort of paint a picture for what my aspirations are and what the troubles that I'm navigating right now are, as it relates to housing, but as it relates to existing in this city. And, you know, I start with this to say that, like, a lot of the work that I've been able to be engaged with has sort of evolved, and we can talk a little bit about how it shows up later, but with this image on the left, just purely asking people what makes home, you know, what do you look for in your home? And we start to get a sense that, like, it isn't just about the 4 walls and roof over their head, right? It's actually about how they have access to amenities, navigate space, connect with other people, and that people are thinking really critically about space, but we're often asking them the wrong questions about that space. And so just quickly to go through again, thinking about how you build being as important as what you build. You know, we, like many other folks, are trying to navigate conversations around smaller living, right? And trying to find, again, alternative ways of thinking about housing. And so for this project in particular, we called it the YooHoo, the Urban Housing Unit. Part of that, you know, the reason that even the language around compact living has sort of shifted from calling it, I can't even remember the original name anymore, but is partly because we know that there's a stigma around this, and that we actually needed to take a step back again and interrogate, you know, is this something that could be valuable for folks beyond sort of this generic idea of, you know, an affluent, like a millennial and, you know, in X, Y, and Z space of frankly our city. And so we spent a lot of time having this unit and touring it around different parts of the city in several different neighborhoods, and actually having people walk through that space and say, does 385 square feet feel right to me? And if not for you, it doesn't make sense for your cousin. Does it make sense for your uncle? Does it make sense for your neighbor? And if it does, what else would need to be there if we were to try and impact policy and try to encourage development to utilize this as a housing typology? And so you can see again in this image on the right, you know, there were sort of scales at which we started to navigate and engage in those conversations, right? Everything from, okay, can you look at a picture and does it feel right? Like does the space feel right? And saying, okay, I think I get it, to let's tape it out, right, in a gymnasium and let's walk through it. Does this feel right? Does this space feel right? To then getting to that point where we're like, okay, let's walk through a physical model of this to say, okay, like let's show you, not just tell you, and let's actually be able to feel like we're grounded in a conversation that we're all having together. And helpful to note that this is an example of a project where, going through that process, we also start to learn that, there are many different stakeholders, but what does it mean to try and have simultaneous conversations with the public, with the developers and the architects, right, and the policymakers to say, we have a moment in time to learn and learn by doing and create the space for this, but it requires us all to be in conversation. And one of the more recent things that we are doing, again, going through a similar process of sort of navigating, some of these questions that we're holding of, okay, in Boston, triple deckers are a really old housing typology that we've had. And I personally live in a triple decker. I'm sitting in one right now, and know that there are accessibility challenges. There's a lot of things that can look different, but there's also a lot of value into having this type of space in which I can connect to my neighbors in a way that some of these new buildings don't necessarily evoke the same opportunity. And it's not to say that those are bad and this is good. It's to say that there is a future of housing and this typology perhaps could have a space there. And so spending time trying to understand with renters and homeowners and folks for many generations who have existed in these types of spaces, what's working, what's not working, and what does a future decker potentially look like? We also, as a team, think a lot about transportation and have spent, one of the earliest collaborations with city department has been with our transportation team. And so thinking everywhere from, if folks are going to be thinking about things like autonomous vehicles, where's the city there to advocate and understand and navigate and create opportunities for folks who are working in the private sector to be encouraged to develop their ideas alongside folks who are going to be impacted by those decisions, and also to work with folks who work in to keep the streets working and running, and so to be able to better understand where are the gaps in the way that you're thinking about your technology, where are we headed in terms of our comfort level with said technology, and what's the sort of infrastructure we need to not be reactive later when that technology gets introduced into our city. And just an analog example again of how you build being just as important as what you build is thinking about these postcards and love letters that I had the pleasure of creating space for, and just saying that making a moment to pause and talk to people about how they're thinking about their space. This is a particular example of saying, hey, don't talk to me, but talk to your neighborhood. And I was really grateful to just see folks actually take the time to sort of pause and be tender, frankly, with their neighborhoods. And you saw not just love letters, but apology letters and letters recognizing that there's a narrative about certain spaces in the city that you carry. And later, if you're asked to reflect, you realize maybe it's not like that, or maybe I've sort of taken a space for granted that that honestly means a lot more to me. So just because I know we're going to run out of time, but lesson 2, thinking about technology and technology as a tool for building trust and compassion. One of the first projects that the Neuromechanics is known for is taking what used to be the mayor's hotline, where you could report issues that you were seeing in your local area, right? There's I see a rodent, there's a pothole, there's all these things, come fix it. And what used to be a process of sort of casting that again onto a call and hoping someone fix it, and really creating a sort of digital platform for that, and being able to say, hey, here's a problem, I've taken a picture of it, I've done this sort of civic action, and wow, okay, here's the people that fixed it. Oh, okay, here's some responsiveness, and here's a little bit of a dialogue that maybe never existed before, beyond that moment of calling it in. Again, thinking about technology to build trust and compassion, this is a sort of pre-COVID and helpful to know that we're still trying to figure out how do we support folks in regards to this, but really thinking about, okay, we have access to all these restrooms that technically are public, but how would you know? And so I think this type of tool is a really simple example of trying to use technology to provide something that apparently should feel common knowledge, but often folks don't really have access to that information. And then I made mention of, having colleagues that specifically think about what does it look like for technology to be, in our public spaces. You can see on the left an example of a recent project of trying to make more clear and make more opportunities for free Wi-Fi to be available in our, around our libraries, our public libraries, to thinking about, okay, we're trying out a sensor here. We're trying to understand the way that the traffic flows in this area. How do we be transparent about it? How do we actually start to create ways and spaces for folks to actually interact with this and question whether or not that's something that, they feel is intrusive, or question whether or not, there's more they want to learn, more they want to know. And so this body of work is one that I think a lot of cities are grappling under the sort of like guise of smart cities. But again, going back to the question of like people being at the core, I think before we get to the technology, saying, all right, well, where do we stand? And thinking about digital storytelling. So I think working with our Department of Innovation and Technology, we've like stood up a practice of, we call it AV club, so audio visual, but really early on, the mechanics had operated, and this was purely because we had folks on our team who had practices in videography and film, trying to support the city in creating digital stories, right? And really trying to share the narratives, not of just the things that the city's doing, but of the stories of the people in the city that really guide all the decisions that are happening, but and should guide all the decisions that are happening, but all the really hard work that folks in like a variety of spaces are doing to make sure that what folks are calling home is actually able to support them. So lesson 3 about enabling and encouraging civic action. We often work with university partners as well, in addition to artists and folks from all different pathways. And one of the things that we had experimented doing was creating a document that like very clearly laid out the questions that we were trying to grapple with. And the reason why this felt really, really useful as an experiment is that, we often, get asked, hey, what can I do? I want to help. Let me know. And, far better than just saying, oh, here's the first thing I can grab on my desk, is saying, here are the things that we're thinking about, and where do you feel like you have a strength in trying to help us navigate this? And again, there are many other ways that this can come about, but we were really excited to try and do that and really create an invitation to architects, designers, as well as academics, as well as community organizations, young people, and say like, this is a starting point for how you can think about the things and the questions, again, no shortage of questions that we must grapple with, I think in our context. Thinking about intergenerational home sharing. So what does it mean to sort of encourage older adults and younger folks to share space? And what does it look like to think about that as, again, a different form of a housing typology, but also a bigger opportunity to be a part of that creation of affordable housing options. And then civic participation. So over the years, that has been something that we have been really acutely aware of, is what do our engagement practices as a city look like? What does it look like when we do that work? And how do we better support thinking really thoughtfully about ways that people are guiding the work, being a part of the work, leading the work, that aren't just folks who are the usual suspects. And, I think even recently now thinking about hybrid and digital engagement and trying to create learning communities within City Hall, and bringing in our sort of university partners and other partners to sort of figure out how are we responding to that as the public? Like, how are we responding to having to have these really critical conversations about the future of our neighborhoods in a new format? And to that end, having the pleasure to work with a really brilliant group of undergraduate students as they bring young people deeper into our process of understanding how we might be able to help young people continue to use their voice, continue to use their actions, and to feel supported and lifted up by the city. And so that is ongoing work that we're trying to do. And I would encourage all of you in your practices to figure out where young people can play a role, and how you can invite them to be a part of the great work that we see across the nation, them already doing, and being leaders in, frankly. Being delightful. The Public Space Invitational is an example of that, of really giving designers and folks the opportunity to figure out like what what the city can look like, and for us to understand the ways in which we're getting in the way, right? What are the sort of like policies, procurement issues, challenges that that really make it hard for folks to experiment and bring more life and joy to public spaces. Thinking about the place in which a lot of folks in at least Boston city government exist in, and not the only space that we do, but our concrete jungle, our concrete building. How do we liven up the inside, right? And how do we liven up the outside and actually move toward? And you can see a lot of our experiments early on, whether that be trying to provide school summer lunches rather, on our sort of lawn, to the stairs of fabulousness, which is the sort of rainbow colored opportunity, not only to lift up the space, but also to help folks navigate going up those stairs, frankly, to trying to create moments of playfulness in that space. And we can see on the right, now a lot of that experimentation has sort of led to actual infrastructure changes, like adding more lighting, or, you know, at where we stand right now, where we are sort of redesigning the plaza in which our city hall stands on, and really trying to figure out how do we prioritize accessibility, sustainability, right, inclusion and welcomingness, and what does it look like to rethink that space. Thinking about what we build being as important as, you know, this is incredibly important. Again, I said that early on. You know, we often fall into this trap of like precedents and the things that like we have already done, have already seen, and don't often open ourselves up. And so I think moving beyond what we already know how to build, and thinking really at the core of like what people want and need, and navigating that as a grounding force is incredibly important. And so circling back to one of the earlier projects I shared, you know, we were using our 311 app to help guide where we made infrastructure changes. And only in the last few years did we realize how inequitable that had been, right? You know, it helped solve a need of really being able to prioritize, but the use of that app across the city was not equal. And so spending time trying to get through that infrastructure related challenge, try and address some of those issues and try and navigate how do we actually figure out where that tool can continue to be useful, but what are the ways in which we can think about supporting the challenges our streets are facing in a different way. And the like really thinking about what people want and need. This is an example of a project where, you know, we had a summer fellow, shout out to our summer fellowship program, where we bring on, you know, upwards of 12 to 15 people during the summer to help push the work and build connections and relationships. We had one summer fellow who asked this really, you know, obvious question of like, what makes a Monum project, right? What is, you know, does this feel right? And what they were asking of whether or not it feels right was they had developed frankly, a series of pizza parties and gatherings and just creating space for folks who were returning citizens to meet this office, to connect with this office. And again, on first look, you're like, there has to be more that I can do. I have to create a service, a system, something needs to happen. But in this moment, what it called for was being that support, that listening ear to that office as they're trying to establish themselves and figure out how we actually support this population. And in this image, you can see creating the space for folks in the middle of a like torrential downpour to show up for each other and say, this is what I want the city to do for me as a returning citizen, as someone who is navigating that aspect of my life. And here are my challenges, and here are the things that I'm, you know, hoping for. And then really impactful, we see across, you know, back to the comment of precedents, we see all around Europe the desire to protect bikers and folks from falling under the wheels of trucks. And, you know, one of the things that our team has had the pleasure of doing is trying to take this idea from our own infrastructure to this sort of like state level and trying to navigate, how do we protect folks, right? How do we not just think about incredible, crucial bike lanes and things like that, but also what are the other things that we can do and put in place that add another extra layer of protection to folks who are navigating our streets outside of vehicles. And last but not least, it's creating a comfort with risk-taking in government, and that's incredibly important. And risk looks very different, you know, depending on the context. Sometimes it's just, again, inviting in a different perspective. Other times it's saying, yeah, we're going to invest this money in this idea. And so what does it look like to create comfort is a process, and we very much spend a lot of time in that entanglement. So very quickly, thinking about, you know, what we can do with our streets and spending time with our transportation department and the folks in public works and arts to think about what can happen, right? Is it more spaces for folks to, pedestrians to engage with the street, right? Is it thinking about street murals? Is it thinking about temporary art, or again, that public space invitational that I had mentioned earlier? We're thinking about young people, right? And the risk, not only that the city takes on saying, we're gonna save with you, but for folks who perhaps don't feel like government is there for them to say, okay, I'm gonna trust that the city is going to save with me for my young person. And so this particular project, you know, there are examples, again, across the nation, but what does it mean for me as a guardian to put a sum of money toward my young person's future and have the city say, we'll put a sum in too, so that when I get to the point that whether it be for college or otherwise, that the city was there for me, right? Thinking about how we bring city government, right, and some of those services, but also opportunities to engage out of these buildings and really onto the streets. So the City Hall To Go truck is an example of that work that has continued to evolve throughout the years beyond our team. And a project, I believe this is my last project slide, but this project is super near and dear to my heart because, you know, while I started thinking, started doing this work with the Housing Innovation Lab, I've been able to support many of the projects that I've shown you all today to some degree, but I've spent the last 3 years working closely with folks who are working in our recovery services team, right? Thinking about folks who are navigating substance use disorders and really dealing with housing insecurity and you know, what does it look like to ask what a welcoming space, what a connective space, what a creative space might look like for them, and thinking about creativity as agency as well, and that welcomingness, right? We know that not everybody is going to have the same welcoming space, but everyone should have a space where they feel welcome. And so this particular project, you can see on the left that, you know, part of the sort of like experiment or pilot attempt at trying to answer the call of we, you know, don't want folks falling into this particular street. We want to make sure that folks are safe. We also want to recognize that if we're telling you you can't be in a particular area of the city, we need to have a better, like a really good answer as to where you can be. And so taking this particular space and trying to, our team help that department and those folks transform it into a space that is filled with life fundamentally, but also knowing that we can do so much before folks show up, right? And so we need to actually create ways of understanding how people are using that space and navigating that space. And which brings me to my second slide of saying, okay, well, what are the ways that we're learning about this space? And in particular for this pilot project, as I said, it was a tent that was gray, no windows. So we said, okay, we're going to invite plants, right? We're going to work with the library, which feels like an unusual partner at the time. And now I was like, yeah, duh, to bring books into that space, to think about passive programming in addition to active programming. And so you see in this image what it means to like bring in an orchestra, what it means to bring in a writing group, and say, how are people going to spend their time in this space and not only grab that cup of coffee and be closer to the opportunity to seek out a resource that they need when they're ready. But this is an example of a really low barrier way of meeting people where they are, and, you know, not forcing folks into their pathway to recovery, but giving them ample opportunity to figure out what they need and how they can get there, and having that be a safe space, a warm space. And, you know, very quickly we learned that, yeah, of course, the physical aspects incredibly matter. They really do. But that has to be paired with how we support the folks who are working in that space, that are the sort of face of that space, and how we make sure that they are also feeling welcome so that they can pass that on, right, to the folks that are guests in that space. And, you know, I would love to just spend time talking about this project in particular, because I think it was a really good example of saying, you know, we aren't going to be able to have data about who's in this space as much as, you know, other projects, right? Folks aren't tapping in and signing their name in this particular example, right? It truly is a low threshold opportunity for you to seek comfort and support. And so we have to think about how we're understanding that space. And so the images on the left are the sort of low, like the sort of very, very quick, tangible ways of having those conversations, of just putting up a sheet and saying, what places in the city feel welcoming or unwelcoming? How's the spacing working for you? How's the space working for you? Asking how people sort of identify and feel as they enter into these spaces, and then moving toward bringing in you know, researchers and working with those researchers to sort of embed ourselves in that space and really try and navigate the wants and needs of both the staff and the guests. And I would say, you know, what's sort of transpired from then is, you know, we've gone from that first space, I'll go back, that you see on the right, to a renovation down on the bottom right, to now thinking about what a permanent space might look like and how we can take what was attempts at trying to learn from very constrained space and build in things like space for staff and all this stuff based off how we learned, but also to now say, okay, if we're going to make a future space, we have all of that learning in addition to continuing to engage those same people. And we can actually take what is a pilot and actually make it a reality. And so I am going to start to end by saying just a reminder of these few tenets that we have learned throughout the work that we're doing. But I would also want to pause and say what I'm sitting with right now in my body as a queer woman of color who is in the context of city government, trying to hold space for a practice, again, like I said, that is not inherently good, and really questioning within myself where I show up, how I show up, and really encouraging the folks that I work with, whether it be internal city departments or you know, architects and partners and folks externally, to say, how do we center humanity and justice and equity, right? What does that look like? How do we acknowledge our power and the possibilities of our actions and the roles we play, right? How do we recognize that the seemingly small details like actually have great impacts, and they can be positive and often fairly negative if we're not thoughtful, and realizing that inaction is an action, and that we have to be critical of the imagination, right? Whose imagination are we standing in? Who was the space that we are operating in designed for? And I think tied to that is thinking about the history, right? There are multiple stories at play in this moment in time. And last but not least, like, we need to choose to care, and really make sure that we're making space for each other to thrive, and sort of circle back to my comments about, you know, young people, but also thinking about Indigenous folks, thinking about, again, non-binary, trans, queer folks who, you know, again, particularly haven't been considered in the past, and can have a really great opportunity to be a part of our future. So with that, I just want to say thank you so much for the opportunity to share all of this with you today, and I look forward to future conversations.
Hi, Sabrina. Thank you so much for the fascinating look into the work that you guys are doing. It's really great to see. I'm going to ask the folks that might be on the YouTube Live link, if you have any questions, can you please put them there in the chat box? And anyone in the Zoom room as well. There is one that has already come through, and I'm sure others are going to start coming in also. But the first question is from Thomas Starinsky about how the work is funded. Is it mostly government funds, city funds? Is it private foundations? A little bit of another strategy?
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. And back to the, like, we're grappling with what does the future of this work mean? That has also come up. But in the last 10 years, the work has been a mix of some city funding, obviously in some of our roles, often a mixed match, and definitely working with philanthropies and other institutions to sort of push forward the work. And, you know, the reason why I bring up that earlier comment about like grappling with it, I think we're trying to figure out, what does it mean for those organizations to really be a part of this picture. And I think we've consistently held our values at the core, but I will say, just to answer the question, it comes from a lot of different places.
Thank you so much. And while we wait for other questions to maybe come in, I mean, there's so many kind of interesting threads about all the work you do, and there's things that we can talk about. The way that young people plug into this work, the way that all these things, and it becomes both pedagogical, but as well actionable. But I'm going to ask you something which maybe our audience might want to hear a little bit more on, is the way that architects, landscape architects, that the built environment kind of designers, how those kind of folks either interface with the kind of work you do, and especially I think some of the things that was seen in the City Hall, for example, in the City Hall project, and how people that may not have that training, how they work also with the housing. How do you end up producing some spatial design as well? So some conversations around that, how those practices kind of can be part of this larger transdisciplinary project, and then how even folks without that official training still enact change within spatial design.
Yeah, I mean, it goes back to my comment about policy being by design too, right? And knowing that like folks who are deciding like where we can build and not build, or all those things, right, like have a role to play. And my interfacing with architects, actually throughout the years, I've always been like architect adjacent. And so I've had the pleasure of, you know, as someone who studied industrial design and was constantly thinking about the built, right? In addition to starting to think about spatially how things come to be and what our sort of roles are. I've had the pleasure of working with really thoughtful architects, but I've also had the pleasure of working with folks who are just starting to realize the impact of what they are doing, that this moment in time where, you know, you sort of are conceptually thinking about space is like one in which you really need to invite like a thoughtful perspective, right? That needs to not just be similar to, you know, similarly like a studio project in which you don't think about, you know, the real human context. You don't think about budget. You don't think about history, frankly, right? And so, yeah, I mean, I've been really, you know, really excited to be in spaces to do that encouragement and also see folks push themselves. And, you know, I think our team is also thinking about that for other different practices around technology or whatnot, to say, you know, what is the sort of implications of your practice, and what are the sort of opportunities of your practice to actually support or harm civic life. And I really do want to implore all the folks who are working in the built environment to really, truly sit with the fact that your work matters and you have power, but those things need to be taken seriously.
Thanks so much, Sabrina. And we have another question from Zach Narva. And he's wondering about the kind of practices that you use to measure change and impact. So practices, tools, processes that you might be using to track some of the work that you're doing.
Yeah. And so the last project example that I shared, the Engagement Center, is like one of those projects that, you know, didn't have the very much, you know, we were able to do some sort of like quantitative metrics, but truly like the foundational understanding of like what was working and not working really came through more qualitative approaches. And I think that that's the case with many of our projects, is that the context really drives like how we're able to understand, because you don't always want to just measure how many people show up. You don't want to just measure how many units were built. You actually want to question the quality of the engagement, the quality of the interaction. And, you know, I often like think about an example that was shared with me of looking at the sort of like tree canopy in a particular area and saying this place has like so much open space, clearly, right? Because there's so many trees here. And then you sort of zero into that data set and realize that actually it's a cemetery and it doesn't actually have those uses you imagine. And so I'm constantly, and I think the team is as well, always looking out for, in the context of this particular project, what are the ways that we can understand what's working, what's not working. And so I think we're definitely open to not just building one one force for understanding those things, because that truly doesn't make sense. But yeah, happy to talk more. Project by project, it definitely differs.
I don't see any more questions in our feed here, either the live feed or here in the Zoom room. So maybe it's a good time to end. And if there's anything else you want to share with us, Sabrina?
Yeah, I mean, I'm very grateful, I think, to be able to like have this conversation here with you all. And again, just to like pick up on the question that you asked, Killian, I really believe that we all have a role to play, and that leading with creativity and trying to untangle a lot of the challenges that we are grappling with today will require all of us, and that it should be seen not as a hindrance to what you've learned or what you've practiced now, but as an opportunity. And so, I think taking every project, every moment of trying to navigate a question about how can this be better, think about who this is going to impact the most, and make sure that they're a part of that work. And also ask yourself, like, what's your motivation for this? And if it is not truly about humanity, if it's not truly about that, then really sit with yourself and consider it. Because I think an example is like looking at like hip hop architecture as like a really good insight into what the sort of impacts of public housing and all these things can be. Like, there are so many unique ways of looking at the challenges we face, and so we need to welcome more than just ourselves into that, and really, yeah, I look forward to what we're able to do, especially in this moment in time.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you so much for sharing all the work that you guys are doing. It's really great to see seeing such change being driven from within government. For the folks, I want to thank the folks that have joined us. We had a little bit over 50 people in both rooms. And I also would like to invite everyone that's still here to our next Friday lunch lecture. It will be by Cordine Lewis Allen, who's the founder and CEO of the Youth Design Center. These are in the neighborhoods of Brownsville and East New York in New York City. And he has been working with young people. He's a trained architect who has been working with young people for about a decade now, and has had some very, very fascinating ways of working, both similarly even to the work that Sabrina showed today, tech, space, design in all its permutations. So we encourage you to join us next week too. Thank you so much, Sabrina. Thank you all.